real talk. In real estate photography, HDR shooting technique is such a common one. But then there is a lot of myth around it. In today's video, let's debunk the myth with our product expert at Esoft, Monsen.
Hello everyone, my name is Mats. I'm a product expert in photography here at Esoft. I've been with Esoft for the last 4 years. Before that, I have an extensive career in both graphic design and commercial photography. So I bring to the table over 30 years of industry knowledge. And today we're going to talk about one of the most popular forms of real estate photography, HDR.
We kind of recognize this shooting technique is very prevalent, very common in the most markets, I would say. Still, there is a bit of stigma around it, so I would like to kind of, dive into it with you a little bit more. So people often say that HDR is more time consuming for the business, and that it's not suitable for scaling. What do you think of that?
Oh, that is definitely a myth that we have to bust today.
Right.
And we can do it immediately because HDR, when done correctly, has proven to be the most effective way for a business to scale. Because you basically just need a camera and a tripod and then teach the photographers about composition.
Exactly.
And this, all the other things with flash and also to use less exposures. If you stick with the 5 exposure program that we recommend, then scaling your business is very easy.
Right. So when you use that 5 ambient shooting exposure technique or HDR, pretty long name, basically it saves you time since you don't have to work with flash equipment and getting the light right.
Exactly. So you cover the tonal range as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
And also by using the 5, you don't have to think about where you're going to measure the light.
Exactly.
So you save time. You can spend that time focusing on getting your composition in the best possible way and work with the end result, the outcome of what you want to do. And that is to make beautiful pictures from this property.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. Right. So another myth I would say that I observed online is people say HDR photography is only used for landscape photography. That I know, and then I think you know too, is not the case for real estate. So what is that reason?
There's a good reason for it because landscape photographers, they often shoot, let's say, early morning or late afternoon, and they want to have the sun in the scene. So the sun is really bright, but they also want to have details. So you already have a high dynamic range of information that you need to capture.
Right.
And that's the same in real estate photography because on a sunny day, the outside view in the garden is like full of light, but then inside, if the section of the house is in the shade, of course you're working with completely different light levels. So you already have a high contrast scene. So both real estate and landscape, they share that in common. And also HDR is now it's everywhere because if you have a smartphone in your pocket, then you have a device that has enabled HDR. So most smartphones, they add this because they know that it will improve the image. So it's everywhere. It's not just limited to landscape photography.
Cool. And then I think one of a very common thing that I have seen many photographers refer to is there's no such thing as HDR night photography. In other words, HDR photography is not applicable in the night, and then for real estate as well. So can you give opinions on this?
Sure, we are busting a lot of myths here today.
Right.
So this is also what happens when you don't have a deep enough understanding of the area. So what's really good about nighttime photography is to look at astro photography.
Okay.
So exactly.
Yeah, cool.
So astrophotographers, they have developed a lot of techniques
Yeah.
So when we merge their technique with the regular HDR technique, means that we can actually produce something that's really good. So to illuminate this a bit more,
Please go.
then astrophotographers, they tend to shoot a lot of the same exposures, and then they stack them and then blend them together to filter out the noise.
Right.
And this is a technique that smartphones also are doing for nighttime photography. So it's very common technique. But if you don't know about it, then it can be a bit daunting to step into nighttime. But we do deliver a lot of what we call dusk images that are shot after the sun has set. And we are doing a lot of HDR brackets for that. But when you add, let's say, 5 extra exposures for the +4 step, 5 extra exposures for the +2 steps, and so forth, and you spend more time blending them together to eliminate the noise, you end up with inputs that then can be used and produce some really stunning visuals.
That's interesting. So basically, you can go more than five. You have five exposure for just 1+4, right?
Yes,
So you would end up with a lot of exposure, but then it eventually reduces the noise, and then you have a beautiful, perfect image.
exactly.
Beautiful. Now, I used to believe in this one, HDR looked fake, but now I know that it's not. So can you explain why?
This is a trick question, really, Kwan. I have to agree and disagree with it. This is a myth that is really hard to bust because it's actually been true for such a long time that HDR looks really fake, especially when you look at the HDR programs at the beginning. They put everything together. They compress the tones. Colors got exaggerated. It looked really fake. And to get away from that sort of fake imagery, what we tend to do is to hand blend so manual blend the exposure layers, and then we build up a more realistic HDR render. So that's the secret to good HDR.
Yeah. So I mean, back in the day, HDR image would look very oversaturated, very sharp, I would say. And then often I would see a very, I would say, animated image of a house online. But then over time, it just gets a lot more natural that people think that it's not HDR. It actually is ADR, right?
Yes, it is. It's HDR with a good editing workflow behind.
Okay, I get it. Cool. And then I think that to me the idea of merging a lot of brackets together seems very tough. Is that the case with the actual post-production process?
That's another good question. It really depends on many factors. It depends on the property of that the photographer is shooting, the light conditions that day, and then the skills of the editor as well. So editors with a good understanding of the end result and a good workflow, then it's easier to control and deliver a good outcome and consistently deliver good quality. So it really comes down to skills, to workflows, and from both the photographer and the editor.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, I mean, when you shoot, is it really hard to kind of get the perfect image? I mean, the perfect aligned files together. Is it really hard?
Again, let's say the photographer is on location. To even do HDR, you need to have a solid tripod. So if you have a good tripod, you have a good tripod head, you don't have any movement between capture, so you do remote triggering, then you make sure that there's very little chance to have alignment issues.
Okay, yeah. But then still when you have that sort of perfectly aligned files, you need a good sort of editing process behind to bring out the result.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So you start with a good shooting workflow
yeah,
and techniques to get the best input. Then you transfer that, and then you need to have the same, but with an editor. So an editor that
I see.
has good skills and a solid workflow
Yeah,
that takes you to the result that you want.
beautiful. All right. So is there any other thing that you could add or any other myth you would want to debunk yourself?
Okay. One thing to make life easier for yourself as a photographer,
Yeah,
there is one thing that you need to look out for
what is that thing?
when you're purchasing your camera gear,
Okay,
and that is to have a camera that has automatic exposure bracketing,
what is that?
AEB. Basically, this will help you to automatically do what you want to do. So let's say we want to have 5 brackets. We can dial into the camera that, okay, we're going to do HDR 5 brackets.
Okay.
And then you dial in how many stops, increments do you want to have?
Yeah.
And you dial in, okay, you want to have 2 stops as increments. And then when you start to take the picture, you click and the camera will do automatically the 5 exposures.
Oh,
That is time saving. That is really, you don't need to worry about, like, if people have an old manual camera and without this function, you actually have to remember, okay, I start at what shutter speed, and then you have to do the mathematics in your head, you have to adjust accordingly. It just slows down the whole process. So why make life hard for you when you can do it easily?
yeah.
So
So
yeah,
maybe if you're holding a very old camera, it's time to change it to something that has the AEB function. I think you just need a one click, right? And
yes,
all the exposure is done.
exactly.
Beautiful. There you go. Well, that's it for debunking the myth about HDR photography. Thank you for watching and we'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to hit the like button. Bye!